All right, we will start now. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing where you're joining us today. And thank you for joining us. My name is Bushra. I am an organizer with the Youth Climate Corps campaign. I'm going to start us off with a land acknowledgement. I've been reflecting on how I wanted to open this conversation today and how critical it is to be sort of talking about the land for this specific webinar, Rooted in Justice. As I open up this space, I want to center my positionality as an immigrant settler in Geojaga, the land that both sustains me and my work on this campaign. This is both an invitation and a reminder of our specific roles and responsibilities in a settler colony. The work that we must do towards justice, healing, and reconciliation. The land sustains us, whether we are natives, visitors, and even if we are uninvited settlers. It has been stewarded, loved, and mourned by the Kanekiaga Nation. My role is to be grateful and helpful to the ancestral and descendant generations of peoples, animals, and plants, air and water, fire and stone, who've related with this land as an endless interconnected family that is part of the whole planet and the cosmos. My presence here is a direct result of colonization, violence, and displacement of peoples and communities that are indigenous to the land. Naming this violence is vital as we set out to do transformative and generative work in our communities. Amidst all the loss and grief we hold in our bodies and communities, it is a gift to share in spaces like this one today and the larger struggle with folks on this panel. With that said, I want to offer a warm welcome to our webinar, Rooted in Justice, Indigenous Youth and the Green Job Revolution. Today, we will engage in dialogue about the revolutionary work that Indigenous communities are leading coast to coast to coast to bring forward a just energy transition. I do want to go through some housekeeping before we get right into the conversation. Today, you're going to hear about our campaign to establish a youth climate corps in this country and how to center Indigenous knowledge and leadership of Indigenous nations at its core. First, you'll hear a little bit from me and my colleague, Erin Blondeau from the Climate Emergency Unit about the Youth Climate Corps and our campaign. Then we will hear from our incredible panelists today. I have a couple of questions for them to start things off, and then we'll open things up to all of the audience members for a Q&A at the end. We plan to be wrapped in a tight 90 minutes, and this event is being recorded and will be shared afterwards. We will be closing the chat shortly, or it may have already closed actually, but mostly because we want to keep things focused on this conversation between the panelists. We encourage audience members and folks that have joined to submit any questions they may want to ask the panelists using the Q&A feature. And if there are questions that have been asked by other participants, you are welcome to upvote questions that you particularly want answered. And if you have a question for a particular speaker, please note that in your question. Another note I want to mention, we are delighted to have a senior graphic recorder and animator, Brittany Dajko, here during our session. As a graphic recorder, Brittany will be listening to our discussions and summarizing the main themes into a visual that we will review at the end of the session, and we'll be sharing it with you all afterwards. Brittany, would you like to say hello to everyone?
Hi, everyone. I am the graphic recorder, so I will be listening to the conversations that are had today, and I'm going to be capturing them as they happen. And you can actually view it happening on YouTube from a live stream. And sorry, I should say who I am. I'm a senior graphic reporter at Fuse Light Creative, and I'm zooming in from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat people, currently known as Toronto. And I'm very happy to be here. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us. Yeah, like Brittany said, you can follow her work in real time by following the YouTube link that we'll be dropping in the chat. Other key housekeeping things is if you want to access translation, we're super happy to be offering English to French audio translation, thanks to our volunteers, Beatrice Geneste and Marwan Jundi. To listen to audio in French, just click the interpretation globe at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select the language you would like to listen in. There's also closed captioning that's provided by Zoom, and you can click that by the CC button below. All right, so for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Youth Climate Corps, I'm going to give my short elevator pitch so that we can bring everyone on the same page. We are building power across this country to win a 2-year job training program that would be both state-led and federally funded to mitigate the climate crisis while putting young people to work. Anyone 35 and under would be able to apply and sign up to get paid job training to do low carbon and climate mitigation and adaptation work in their communities. We envision the training to fall under 3 different buckets of jobs. So there's the first, emergency preparedness and response work, which includes care work in our definition of it. There's the strengthening community and environmental resilience work, focusing on enhancing natural ecosystems, improving local infrastructure, and strengthening community supports in anticipation of climate disruptions. And then the third would be around building infrastructures, local infrastructures such as installing renewable energy systems and improving energy efficiencies around our homes and our communities, as well as building public transit systems. In practice, a Youth Climate Corps would bring to life local climate action plans, and in areas of this country where they don't exist, we would support the creation of them. In this moment of despair where many young people like me are grappling with dreaming of our future, this campaign demonstrates a potential for young people to fall in love with that future, wrestling with climate anxiety, mental health issues, underemployment, and new life-altering world events at a frequency we've never seen before. A Youth Climate Corps is a hopeful solution which invites young people to build a societal and economic transformation that they dream so direly for. I'm going to hand things over to my colleague, Erin, to further explain this vision and some key campaign principles behind this campaign and some recent successes. But first, we wanted to share a short inspirational video about the Youth Climate Corps and what it could achieve, produced by the Edmonton-based Sticks and Stones.
Young people are good at making history.
Even when the fight felt unwinnable.
Or unpopular.
Or inconvenient.
When we knew the truth,
we fought. We know the scale of the climate emergency.
We're fighting, even as systems break down.
Wages stagnate,
and the cost of basic survival skyrockets.
We keep showing up.
But our leaders, they're not there yet.
There has been no invitation to confront this civilizational threat.
No public programs to use our talent and energies. We're told only to wait, quietly, if we don't mind.
But we're not waiting anymore.
And it starts
with the Youth Climate Corps.
It's time for a brash and transformative new public program.
One that puts thousands of young people to work, reducing greenhouse gas emissions and strengthening communities.
Building new renewable energy projects.
Protecting biodiversity.
retrofitting our buildings.
so we can live in dignity and safety and take care of each other as we face the unprecedented.
We deserve nothing less than good green work.
A living wage,
And access to union representation.
a program that places Indigenous knowledge and self-determination at its heart.
A program that invests in equity.
And making the future of work one in which we can all see ourselves.
A program that provides a pathway to continuing education and a career confronting the climate crisis. And a program that can say to every person under 35,
If you understand that we face a climate emergency,
and you want to meet this generational challenge now, then we have a place for you.
No one will be turned away because we've tried our hand at making history.
Now we're ready to defend our future.
How will we win?
Organize,
Advocate.
Vote
join the movement for a youth climate corps.
at climateemergencyunit.ca/climatecorps.
Thanks, Bushra, and I always love watching that video. Tansei Kiawao, Erin Blondeau, Dishnakashun. My name is Erin Blondeau, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm a Métis mom living on the West Coast in traditional and unceded Cowichan territory. I'm Métis on my dad's side with ancestry from Estevan, Saskatchewan, coming from the Red River settlements and the Qu'Appelle Valley. Some of my family names on my dad's side are Blondeau, Lajmadir, Robillard, and Desjardins. And on my mom's side, we are Ukrainian Mennonite, Eastern European, and British. Some of our family names on my mom's side are Williams, Haggard, Wall, and Unra. I am honestly so excited to be here at the Rooted in Justice webinar, and I want to start us off by telling a quick story about what my life was like before my son was born. Like so many of my friends, and probably many of you listening right now, I grew up in deep poverty. By the time I was 12, I had experienced homelessness, and I knew what it was like to go to bed hungry. I dropped out of high school several times, but I never gave up, and I eventually earned my adult dogwood diploma. I was thrilled that I could finally enroll in university and be the first person in my family to graduate from post-secondary. But in order to actually afford tuition and rent, I had to work 3, sometimes even 4 jobs at once. But I was determined to achieve what I've been told for so long by colonialist society and politicians, that if we just put in the hard work and pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, we can make it. But that's not how reality works under capitalism, and anyone who has lived in poverty knows this deeply. Eventually, I dropped out of university because I couldn't afford it. But then I found out I was going to have a baby. Before our beautiful son was born, my partner and I sat in our living room and we weighed our options for the future. What could we do to bring in enough money to live safely and provide security for our child? We were broke, living in a rundown apartment in a really bad neighborhood, but I knew that I wanted more for my son. I was desperate for opportunities that would lift us out of poverty. I remember even asking my partner if he would join the military, but thankfully he called my bluff on that one. But still, there just weren't many options available for us. The military is the only national job program in Canada with a low barrier entry. We need more national job options for young people. If there had been a youth climate corps, we both, my partner and I, would have enrolled immediately. We would have had opportunities to train and learn new skills and actually be paid fairly. My partner could have participated in an exciting job program offering free education and job placement right as we were about to welcome a new baby into the world. We could have had financial security. But without such a program, we struggled for many, many years. I eventually re-enrolled in university after receiving some money from the Métis Nation, and my partner ended up finding an apprenticeship program with a local union. But we could have saved years of financial stress and avoided the massive debt we've accumulated if we'd had the chance to join a youth climate corps. 2021 was the first year that we personally lived through a deadly large-scale climate disaster, the heat dome that killed over 600 people. This extreme fossil fuel caused heat wave rocked us to our core. A youth climate corps could have saved lives in this disaster by training young workers to retrofit homes with AC and heat pumps and having teams that could check on vulnerable community members. The heat dome only solidified my desire to do something meaningful, to help transition society away from fossil fuels, away from runaway greenhouse gas emissions, and from the extractive economy that only prioritizes profits before people. That's what I love about the Youth Climate Corps. It would give young people the chance to work at scaling sustainable infrastructure like solar panels and wind turbines and public transportation and strengthening our communities through care work. And we know that many Indigenous nations have already been doing this work, and many nations continue to also resist the unrelenting colonial expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure like LNG pipelines, just like we're seeing in Wet'suwet'en territory, or even fighting for justice after decades of environmental racism and poisoned watersheds like we're seeing in Grassy Narrows. We know that the government has a way of messing things up or watering down bold and ambitious programs that come from movements just like this. That's why we, alongside the young activists in the Youth Climate Corps campaign, have developed 6 core campaign principles. These principles are kind of like our demands for any and all government engagements, and they function as mutual agreements for all of us in the Youth Climate Corps campaign. I will give a quick summary of the principles, but to view them in full, you can go to goodgreenjobsforall.ca. So the first principle is good green jobs for all. This means that a Youth Climate Corps must uphold workers' rights and provide dignified careers that turn no one away. The second is build the fossil fuel-free future. The Youth Climate Corps must be evidence-based and work in collaboration with Indigenous nations, industry, students, and climate experts. The next principle is what brings us here today: center Indigenous knowledge and sovereignty. A Youth Climate Corps must respect the inherent title and rights of Indigenous nations and center the needs, knowledge, and leadership of communities. Nations must be able to give free, prior, and informed consent to all projects on their territories. The next principle is empower local needs and priorities. This means that a Youth Climate Corps must allocate resources with consideration of all of Canada's regions and community climate plans. Then we have rooted in justice. This means that we must acknowledge, prioritize, and tell the truth about the ongoing environmental racism that impacts Indigenous and impoverished populations. And the last principle is make it big. The Youth Climate Corps must be a brash and transformative national program, not a nonprofit organization or a wage top-up. It must be government funded, but with communities setting strategic priorities at the massive scale needed to confront this civilizational threat. Today's event is about discussing the incredible work being done by Indigenous nations and communities all across Turtle Island to ensure that the Youth Climate Corps always centers Indigenous knowledge and sovereignty. And with that, I will pass the mic to our inspiring panelists to briefly introduce themselves. And first, I will pass it to Serena.
Scano, Nyagoa, and thank you for having me. It's so lovely to be on a panel with the Climate Emergency Unit, the Youth Climate Corps, and my fellow panelists who I've been privileged to work with, every single one of them in different capacities. So Serena Nigauso, Ga Kono ni Kwanzote, Ochinige Shoute. I am Serena Mondisabel. I am Cayuga Wolf Clan from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. I am also from Panama, my dad's side, south of the Medicine Line. Six Nations is the largest or most populous First Nation community in so-called Canada, and we're about an hour south of Toronto. And I have been working in climate and environment for almost a decade. but also in youth advocacy, actually, since I was 8 years old, due to the wonderful work of my mom and how she always dragged me to different grassroots events. And where I really began to see the intersection was when I first started in my community. I worked at the Development Corporation, and I was in a low-level position working on like community engagement, consultation, education for utility scale projects, so renewable energy projects, where we have the largest clean energy portfolio of any First Nation in so-called Canada, with solar and wind assets. And a big part of what I felt, being a woman, being a young person, in my community, was that I wasn't necessarily invested in. And I still kind of felt that after leaving the Development Corporation, that I wasn't being invested in. I had a lot more potential than what was actually there. So from there, I've dedicated of that intersection of making sure that Indigenous youth feel empowered, to lead within the climate and clean energy sector, because we've inherited the issues of yesterday, but it's the issue, or we've inherited those who have created the issues from yesterday, and we're dealing with it today. And so that's really a big part of where my work is grounded within, is hopefully making people feel good and making people feel empowered to be able to implement the solutions they want to see for a just climate future. Yeah.
I can chime in, and now I thank you to Serena, and thank you to my fellow panelists and the Climate Emergency Unit and the Youth Climate Corps for putting together this panel. I know there's always a lot of work that goes into coordinating, across multiple time zones. So just thank you again for that. Sego Sewakwego, Carol Ni'i Yungets, Gini Ngahaga Wagationi, Oswego Neduagenu. My name is Carol Montour. I am Mohawk Wolf Clan from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, where I'm calling to you from. Like Serena mentioned, our community is the most populous First Nations community in the country. We've dealt with a long history of urbanization and industrialization that's impacted our territories. And when I was in university, I went to McMaster for Indigenous Studies. And when the pandemic happened, I ended up putting my degree on pause. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, and I think with the worsening of the climate crisis, as Erin mentioned, the heat dome being impacted by that, I think that was a wake-up moment for a lot of us. That happened actually in the same time span as the graves being discovered at the Kamloops Residential School. And that happened in the same month. And for me, I had this moment of a lot of, I'm going to be honest, a lot of darkness and uncertainty for my future at the time. And I didn't want to go into, just a job that wasn't going to match up with my values. I didn't want to just get a corporate job. I felt really sort of stuck with my options. I had done retail, I had done food service, wasn't really for me. And so I feel like a lot of young people wrangle with that of, you don't really want to work low paying minimum wage work. You don't really want to do the whole corporate job thing. And it leaves you feeling really stuck. And I'm fortunate enough, I'll talk about my organization later, but I think I was fortunate enough to find a niche with my employer in climate education. But I think that the work that I get to do alongside Indigenous communities really brings my life a lot of meaning, getting to connect with other people, and talking about climate change. I think people are able to understand that climate change is here, it's happening, it's worsening, and there's a lot of frustration on, okay, well, what do we do now? And so I think that this panel is a great place to talk about what do we do now? And we'll talk a little bit more later, but thanks.
Hadi Zanhunzu, hello, good day. Susie Janella Point, Dalatan Inkaz Laksoyu Asli, Atsu and Emma Baker, Atsien and Willie Baker, Alu and Michelle Baker, Abba and Renee Lapointe, Stella Kea, Hubuyangkat Etspa, Tatsin and Janasya. Hello, everybody. My name's Janella Point. Thank you so much for having me. I am from Dalatan First Nation Caribou Clan. I'm here representing 7 Gen today, but I'm very fortunate to wear a few different hats in the environmental realm. But what's most important to me is where I come from. So I introduced my my matrilineal line, my parents and my grandparents, Emma Baker, who is a Dakas elder, and my Black and Choctaw grandfather, the late Willie Baker. I'm usually living and working on the beautiful unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. But today I'm very fortunate to be calling in from my own home, the village of Stella, which is on unceded Dakas territory, the very place, the very river where my grandmother was born, and grateful to be home and harvesting and resting for the rest of the summer. So excited to be here. I was really brought to this work also almost a decade ago because of all of the things we are fighting against. I love my homelands. I think they're so beautiful and abundant, but I also consider it a microcosm of colonialism and capitalism. And I think that is also apparent alongside the beauty. I can look out the window right now and see Highway 16, the highway of tears, where Indigenous women, girls are disproportionately found missing and murdered. There's been a cycle of boom and bust industries, from forestry to mining, and now to LNG. And yeah, I hold both the hope and grief of being in a place like this. I moved away from my community at 18, thinking I would pursue a traditional career path, and was very much overwhelmed by the grief I felt being away from my community, and also just learning language to put to the systems and experiences that I have witnessed all the way through, and was brought into the movement because I was called to act by the Secwepemc and Tecumseh people who were fighting against the Trans Mountain Pipeline while I was in university, and then kind of dove headfirst into that world. But as all of those fights continue and there's new projects on the table constantly, I'm recognizing the need to think about what we're fighting for and to be building movements that way. So I'm really inspired by the Youth Climate Corps and the visionary solution-centric work that's happening here, and really excited to talk about how it relates to the organization I'm representing, and also my personal experiences. So thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. My name is Aubriana Liberty Pilbisconius, and I'm the fourth panelist here. I'm very thankful to be here as well. I think just hearing the introductions of, the folks who have spoken before me, I'm just in awe of them, and I'm also excited to learn while I'm on this panel. And so I'm definitely looking forward to the discussion to come, but my pronouns are she, her. I'm from Canoe Lake Cree First Nation on Treaty 10 territory in northern Saskatchewan, and Little Pine First Nation on Treaty 6 territory in central Saskatchewan. I was raised with a lot of my Plains Cree teachings, and so I am very fortunate to have learned a lot from my Mushum in my time growing up, Gerald Pilbisconius, and I really think that the sense of connection that I have to the land is from everything that I watched him do growing up. And so I'm joining you right now from just outside of what's currently called Saskatoon, Saskatchewan at Wanuskewin. I'm actually here for our Indigenous Clean Energy staff retreat. So if at any point you hear people talking, you'll hear the energy of our organization that I'm excited to share more about. But what I do at ICE is I'm the Imagination Program Manager, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on in the webinar, but it's a really exciting program that we do in partnership with Student Energy and 7Gen to empower young people to build clean energy projects and inspire their communities. For me, myself, I found myself in the climate and clean energy space just 5 years ago. And so for me, I was raised in an urban setting with young Cree parents who were just trying to do the best that they could, having 3 kids. And for us, our parents always raised us around ceremony, and they raised us to really be proud of who we were and take pride in going back home and seeing how our mushum and our cookum and our aunties and our uncles interacted with the land. And for us, that was something that was always really beautiful to see growing up. And then as I was getting older, I was noticing that going to ceremony, we would be going through like these heat waves, and then people would be getting sick at ceremony, and it would be a lot harder to carry out the things that we would typically be doing as a people. And it was in those little ways that, you know, I was seeing how it was impacting my own family and exactly what that meant. And so when I was going into post-secondary, and my so many people told me, you know, we need more Indigenous people in business. And so I went into a Bachelor of Commerce, and ended up taking a finance major. And I was in that space, and I felt like there just wasn't enough that I was doing as I was going back home and seeing what was happening in my communities. And then thankfully one day I found myself at an Indigenous clean energy gathering in Ottawa. And since then I've never left the space. It was a way that I found that I could use some of the technical skills that I learned in my commerce degree and apply them to a sector that I really felt was gonna give back and could really harness the traditional teachings that we had in a modern way. And so I've been in the clean energy space for the last 5 years now since then. And from this community, I've really found myself invested in as a young Indigenous person. When I was in other spaces, I often found that, you know, our voices weren't heard and we weren't acknowledged as people who were currently leaders or could be leading movements or making change. We were seen as people that, you know, well, they'll come later and we don't have to worry about them just yet. Whereas once I joined the clean energy space, I think a lot of folks that I got to meet really recognize that projects often take years to develop and years of negotiation. And so if you start investing in the youth at the start, they're going to be the ones that are going to be leading it throughout the process. And when they do get to the point that they're fully operational, those young people are then leading the projects. And so it was a really beautiful process to see, you know, how important and centered Indigenous youth were in that process. And it's really why I'm really happy to be part of the conversation today, so that we can, you know, frame some of these initiatives coming forward to really embody those same values and principles that we see in the ICE space, and why I'm very thankful for the community that we have and hopefully can build across into a youth climate core. So I look forward to the conversation, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, for introducing yourselves and your journeys and sort of what brings you into this work. So inspiring. And yeah, can't wait to follow your guys' journey. My first question to everyone here is to tell me a little bit more about the work you are up to, your organizations are up to, and how a Youth Climate Corps, if and when created, could support this work. Some of you folks have already sort of touched on this, and yeah, I want to hear more. Serena, I'm going to pass this on to you.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I totally didn't mention that I have a full-time daytime job to you guys. I'm not just doing grassroots activism on the side, even though I wish I was. But this is where my work comes in, because I'm able to bring that kind of frontline work right to my everyday job. So yeah, I work at Sacred Earth Solar, and we're an Indigenous-led grassroots woman and two-spirit-led organization. And we bring climate solutions and healing initiatives directly to the front lines of land protection, cultural resurgence, and language revitalization. I've been here, it's my 2-year mark this year, and I have been in multiple different roles, from program assistant to just transition lead to just transition manager, and currently I'm the interim managing director. So really looking at the direction of this organization. So this question really aligns with some of the stuff, strategic thinking that I've been having lately. A big part of the work that we do is to work in solidarity with Indigenous communities and organizations who are protecting their homelands, who are protecting their culture, who are protecting their language, and those who have actually been most impacted by extractive industries, land dispossession, and climate change. Right now, and the vision and the dream is that we believe the time has come to reintegrate the wisdom of our ancestors and implement a just transition. Through our sense of what implementing a just transition is, it would be that we support communities, one, with climate solutions as one of our core pathways. So actually the physical infrastructure that will support communities to, one, lower greenhouse gas emissions, but also to provide healthy, safe, and comfortable spaces of gathering. 2, education and training. Really that capacity building approach that we realized while implementing projects, we can't really implement projects without providing education and training and without providing capacity building. So that could be with education, but also community engagement. As I said, I worked in my own community when I first got in it, and community engagement was an issue. So that's really essential to the projects that we're doing and why Sacred Earth really emphasizes in one of our pathways around education, training, engagement. We also focus on advocacy and policy, which has been a core tenet of where Sacred Earth was really born out of, as an organization that was born out of the tar sands movement against tar sands. So really the nature of our org is to be against fossil fuels and to really integrate a transition into our lives. And lastly, healing justice. You can't be healthy without the lands and the waters, and healing justice is climate justice. So how are we supporting those who are on the front lines of these climate movements, such as all the lovely people on this panel, to support their health, wellness, and healing? A youth climate corps could definitely help us out at Sacred Earth Solar. One, with our pathway around climate solutions, it would actually, a youth climate corps would provide more opportunities for communities looking to implement solutions, which is exactly why our org exists. And SES, we would be able to use the funding and support communities with the funding to help with providing that capacity to those who actually want to lead projects themselves. Right now, we really take a project management approach. So I think if we were able to build a youth climate corps, SES would be able to use that to our advantage to actually support communities and young people who want to lead projects. And we can really align more so as a resource instead of taking that project manager and actually having young people do the projects themselves, and we can just be a resource. The big part, though, I think, too, when it comes to our other pathway around education and training, that I think would be really important is it would create more opportunities for projects, one, which would then in tandem create more opportunities to support us to be able to employ more education, training, capacity building with communities, such as what I was talking about before. As I mentioned, we started with projects, and while doing projects, we really realized the key to these projects is capacity building. And a lot of the time, I think what I've seen in my own community, what I've seen in other communities, what we see currently across so-called Canada is Indigenous communities not being informed enough to be able to make decisions around the projects that are coming on their homelands. So what if we completely switch the flip on that, and they're actually the ones leading the projects, right? And I think the Youth Climate Corps would provide an opportunity for them to lead the projects instead of just being equity owners. I think this is this big thing right now for First Nations ownership. Oh, I have like a 10% equity ownership in a project, instead of another project where it's community led and it's coming from the ground up from the people and it benefits the people 100%. Really thinking about people and lands over profit. And I'll just lastly touch on with this is we recently launched the Just Transition Guide with ICA and DSF, 180-page resource for finding pathways to climate solutions and resiliency. There has not really ever been a guide quite like this. And if we begin to see the shift, it gives us the opportunity to do more of that kind of work, to be able to implement more knowledge into our communities, to actually get communities excited about wanting to take in that knowledge. So that it really provides us an opportunity to excel and to expand what we're already doing, really focusing on the scale of where this can go. And lastly, I just think around advocacy and policy, the Youth Climate Corps will provide a platform for us that aligns with us and what we're already do, from values to divestment to renewable to investment in renewable energy. If we have a Youth Climate Corps and we're really putting that emphasis around this green job revolution, then they have to listen to us at that point. They have to listen to young people. They have to listen to Indigenous peoples, because it's literally in their federal budget. It's literally in their 5-year plans. It's written in the paper, right? So we can really hold them accountable to the things we want to see in the world if the Youth Climate Corps is put through. Yeah, now I'll pass it to the next panelist.
Awesome. I think that's me. Yeah, really excited to tell you a bit more about 7Gen. It's a youth council that focuses on empowering young Indigenous leaders to shape a sustainable and equitable energy future. We're really focused on capacity building and creating space for Indigenous youth to advance in the sector through programs that build capacity, provide mentorship, and offer opportunities for advocacy. The name 7Gen is inspired by the Lakota prophecy that the 7th generation will lead and bring change, and Indigenous youth today are that 7th generation. My grandma tells me every time I visit, she says, "You are the seventh generation," and to be proud of who I am and who I come from, because I come from people who were nomadic over a vast, large territory that had hereditary chief systems that took advantage of the wealth of the land, but distributed it amongst our clan system. We had a really advanced governance system, and people that were able to, survive hot summers and harsh winters and only took what they needed. And so that's the legacy I carry, and really grateful for organizations like 7Gen that model that principle. We had our 7Gen had their first summit in 2019 and brought 200 Indigenous youth from across Canada, and are continuing to build momentum. Even when things slowed down in the pandemic, we were able to launch the Imagination program that Aubrianne now works on and lives in Indigenous clean energy. And this year, our summit is taking place this October in Iqaluit, Nunavut, to bring together youth from the north and south. And we were really intentional, and we're really excited and grateful to our hosts, because Indigenous youth from the north and rural communities are historically and presently excluded from the conversations in clean energy and climate action. So we're really excited to bring youth together and to empower them that way. And yeah, there's just so many overlaps with what Serena said, and just the Youth Climate Corps in general. Of course, being a capacity building centered organization, we'd be really excited about all the ways that the Youth Climate Corps can continue to collaborate to offer Indigenous youth hands-on opportunities, to amplify Indigenous leadership. I think it's really important that we're thinking about Indigenous youth not just as participations, but leaders, and also people that come from all these vast nations that have that legacy of being the only people to be able to survive sustainably in those lands, and for youth to really feel like they're empowered to take leadership and addressing the climate crisis and living their values. I was really moved by Erin's personal story, because it's one that's familiar and I think resonates with so many different Indigenous people and communities. I know that finding a job is hard, period, no matter who you are in this country. I also know that the entire colonial project is about disconnecting Indigenous peoples from the land. And the truth is, in my small rural Indigenous communities, there is no work for me that aligns with my cultural values. There is no way for me to live and work in my community without working for or with the industries that are perpetuating the climate crisis. And that makes me really sad. And so a lot of youth either have to make the huge sacrifice of trying to get an education that still doesn't, guarantee a culturally aligned job, or they have to move away from their communities to find other work, or they have to, sacrifice some of those cultural values in order to survive and to provide. And so I'd be really excited to see a Youth Climate Corps be able to provide an opportunity for youth to have meaningful work, where they can work for and with their community, and not have to live outside of their homelands. And I think that really threatening to the powers that be. And so it's really important that we're building this alliance now, between a really visionary project and all the nations and organizations working in this space.
Thanks, Janelle. I'll hop on and just talk a little bit more about my organization. So Indigenous Climate Action, ICA, we are a Indigenous-led climate justice organization. For a long time, we were the only Indigenous-led climate justice organization here in so-called Canada. I'm not sure that's true anymore, but we were the first. And in my opinion, humble opinion, I think we occupy like a really unique sphere and in a niche. And I think that the approach that we take is really unique to me. And we envision a world with sovereign and thriving Indigenous people and cultures leading climate justice for all. And so we inspire action through the development of tools and opportunities created with, by, and for our community, with the goal of uplifting Indigenous voices, sovereignty, and stewardship of the lands and waters for future generations. And we have a number of programs and pathways that a Youth Climate Corps could really support in a number of ways. I work particularly within education and training on the Climate Leadership Program. And the Climate Leadership Program came out of a community stated need that we needed more information and knowledge on climate change in our communities that wasn't through a white mainstream lens. I think a lot of people, I'm sure on this panel, many of the people watching this webinar are aware that a mainstream climate movement is very white dominated and is often a very wealthy space as well. And it can be tricky to operate in those spaces sometimes as an Indigenous person, as a young person, where you feel really out of place. And we don't want to have to, translate and put our experiences into that box. We want to do that on our own. And at ICA, we do that through our Climate Leadership Program. And it's a popular education style community workshop by and for Indigenous people, which positions our rights and our knowledge systems as a primary solution to the climate crisis. Outside of, again, that mainstream climate movement where you see a lot of these depictions on just green energy, I think that green energy renewables are an extremely important part of solving the climate crisis, but it's a piece, right? And so what does it say when the vast majority of people can envision a world that's free from fossil fuels, that's run on 100% renewable energy, but in turn, they can envision a world with sovereign and thriving Indigenous people. And that's what we do at ICA. And we want to inspire Indigenous peoples to feel competent and capable of taking climate action that is rooted in their cultural values. And again, outside of that lens, right? We don't want to have to translate ourselves into that. We know, we hear all these stats all the time. Indigenous people are 5% of the world's population, yet we safeguard 80% of the world's biodiversity. There's reports through Oil Change International and the Indigenous Environmental Network that compiled a decade's worth of research and found that Indigenous frontline resistance to oil and gas projects has actually reduced emissions equal to Canada and the US's annual emissions by about 25%. So our people are here and we are leading this, right? We are climate leaders. And we want to uplift our people to be able to take that into climate solution work. Nobody understands our territory better than we do. And we have such deep relationships with the lands that we come from and responsibilities to them. And I think that a Youth Climate Corps could really support that work by supporting those initiatives that come out of the Climate Leadership Program. I like to think of it as planting a seed, and where people take that is kind of up to them. We want to get people into a place where everybody has the same baseline understanding of what has caused climate change. And I think that education is such a key part of that, because you can't talk about how to solve a problem if you don't understand what's caused it in the first place. And I think that a Youth Climate Corps could support that work in making that training and that education more accessible, but then again, supporting what comes out of that. I think that a Youth Climate Corps could be a really clear action item that once people finish the program, we can say, this is something that you can join. We work with many young people. I would say over half of our participants are youth, they're under 30. And there's people who are often asking, how do I get a job like this, like with what you do? And I think that a Youth Climate Corps could be a great action item to say, hey, you can participate in this. I could go on and on, but I do think that that education and training piece is super important, and supporting community members who are doing the work, who want to do the work. And like Janelle said, many of us exist in communities where you can't stay in community and work. A lot of our communities have been impacted by extractive industry. You don't want to go into that work. Here at Six Nations, our local economy in a lot of ways is bustling. We always have jobs, but a lot of it are cigarette shacks, cannabis dispensaries now, gas stations, right? That's not long-term work that's meaningful. And I think that a Youth Climate Corps could really offer meaning to people who are searching for it. And I think we'll talk a little bit more later on about what that could look like more, but I'll pass off to Aubrianne.
Awesome. It's really definitely hard to follow up everything that your amazing organizations are doing, but I'm so happy I was able to hear about it. So I want to share a little bit about Indigenous clean energy. So we're the leading platform in accelerating First Nations, Inuit, and Métis participation in clean energy projects from coast to coast to coast. ICE really supports Indigenous communities to be clean energy agents through capacity building, skills development, career training, mentorship, with high quality and hands-on programming. And so we have different programs that exist within Indigenous clean energy, such as like our 2020 Catalyst program, our Bringing It Home program, our ICE network, which connects clean energy champions across the country, and then different advocacy initiatives and much, much more. The organization has grown so much in just recent years, and you'll hear people coming in the room, just a heads up, because now we're just at our retreat. So it's definitely quite exciting for us to be able to collaborate in person. And so one of the sides that I want to speak to specifically, though, that's going to be relevant to a youth climate corps is our youth programming. And so at ICE, we have a program called Generation Power, which is a program that was developed for Indigenous youth to be able to take on jobs in the clean energy sector. It's actually a program that I myself have taken and benefited from and have since learned so much to be able to be in this space today and where I am. And so what we do is we provide wage subsidies for Indigenous communities or different organizations, government, anything like that, to hire on Indigenous youth into this space so that they can get real experience from anywhere from 4 months to 12 months in their internships. And then while in that program, the employers actually receive equity training, so they themselves are learning in this process. And it's not just looked at as them providing a lending a hand to Indigenous youth to get experience. It's actually for them to also build their own capacity to be able to continue hiring on Indigenous young people in the space. And on top of that, the youth receive supports outside of just their wage in the form of wraparound supports, which are supports that we provide to help them with childcare, Wi-Fi access, technology, anything like that, so that we're recognizing the gaps that exist outside of just finding a job. There's much more that goes into it to allow us to be full agents in this movement. And so on top of that, we also have our Imagination program, which I mentioned, which is in partnership with Student Energy and 7Gen, and housed under Indigenous Clean Energy. And so it's a really beautiful program. I think about it as like a clean energy accelerator for Indigenous youth, and it's really exciting. I'm obviously biased because I am the program manager of it, but it's really beautiful in the sense that we get to give Indigenous youth $50,000 to lead their own clean energy projects in their community. And so it's a really beautiful way that we put power into their hands. And the way that we run the program isn't that we look at it again as us giving them money and they get to benefit from us. It's that we're there to be team members of their projects and be able to help them mobilize them, because oftentimes, you know, the youth that are in this space, and we've heard it time and time again in this panel, they're not only working on one project, they're instead working on many across like their communities, across different organizations. And so we really want to be there to be a helping hand. And again, they also receive wraparound supports, but they also receive an elder engagement fund, which allows them to make sure that traditional teachings are embedded in their project and that language is at the forefront of it as well. And then they also receive professional development funds so that they can go to conferences or get technical training or anything like that. And on top of that, we also provide mentorship for them so that they have a mentor and technical advisors that they can meet with on a regular basis to build out their project plans. And so it's really quite amazing what these youth programs do. So that's to say that a youth climate corps can exist, but it should also recognize that there have been organizations that are Indigenous led that have been already doing this work that can be learned from in the ways that we've tried to provide a holistic approach to getting people into the clean energy space and into the climate space as a whole. And so actually just today, I released a policy brief called Sustainable Jobs for Indigenous Clean Energy Action. And it's a brief that we actually launched that really complements this webinar actually, and it was not planned that it would be released today, but it's really great. And we have 4 key recommendations in there that include advancing joint governance and co-design implementation when it comes to sustainable jobs, support Indigenous definitions of what sustainable jobs are to our communities, enable Indigenous equity to create adaptive and flexible funding mechanisms, and then scale up the Indigenous workforce capacity building. And so it's really quite amazing. We'll share the link in the chat to that. It's a really great policy brief that our organization was able to do and kind of really complements this work. And so for us, there's so many ways that a youth climate corps, you know, could support the work that we're doing, but the main thing really is that collaboration and learning from the leadership that's already taken place in this space to advance and mobilize and really catalyze change when it comes to youth leadership in these projects and in these spaces. I've even seen in my own work, I do my master's, I'm a grad student, and what my project was called Indigenous Voices for Energy Literacy. I'm still working on it right now. And what we saw was a curriculum gap in primary and secondary schools when it came to energy literacy. And at that, if there was any energy literacy, there was no Indigenous representation in it whatsoever. And so what we did is we went into communities and we highlighted clean energy champions in a way that teachers would be able to easily implement this into their classrooms and learn from Indigenous people. And what I found is that just being able to film those videos and have Indigenous peoples speaking through these discussions is that they know so much more than you would ever learn in a classroom, in a webinar session like this. You learn from them because of their lived experiences and their time on the land, and really getting to see what they can do. And it's amazing when you see, you know, the connectedness that they have from their traditional teachings. And so it really means that we want to put that at the forefront, and we do that at ICE, and hopefully a youth climate corps can embody this as well.
Wow. Yeah, thank you so much for all of those answers. All of that resonates so deeply. Especially the thing about meaningful work, the constant job search, the fact that we're expected to have these like networks, you know, or to know what a CV looks like, or just the guidance of a two-parent double income home that many of us don't have or haven't experienced the support of. And what does it look like to build a career in meaningful work without those things and without that support? And y'all have done it, you know? Yeah, the next question is, what would a youth climate corps look like centering Indigenous knowledge and leadership of Indigenous nations at its core?
Yes. Okay. I think I start this one. And so it's such a huge question to take on. And I've really been trying to reflect on it. And I was just saying before we started this webinar that I was in a vehicle with all of my coworkers, and we were really kind of trying to strategize and see, you know, what this would look like to us as folks that are in the clean energy space specifically, and what we've seen from Indigenous communities already. And so one of the first and foremost things that we all said was that we need to look kind of beyond formal education that you see in the climate space. You know, we oftentimes in these positions, we're expecting people to have post-secondary education or to have certain certification to be working in different jobs, when really the lived experiences of many Indigenous folks and Indigenous young people is well beyond what, like I said, that we'll learn in these classrooms. And so for us, it's, you know, making sure that we're not just valuing Western education, we're valuing the quality and ability of Indigenous folks and their traditional teachings that are passed on through all of our lives to be, you know, something that's equivalent to a PhD to many of us. You know, I often hear people say that, you know, just being on the land, that, you know, that's the same level of education that you would have gotten in a classroom, just in a different way. And nobody tends to recognize that from young people, that they have that when they're raised in community and around their people and with their teachings and with their elders. And for our youth that don't have that, giving them the opportunity to be back on the land, to have those teachings, because oftentimes our youth that are disconnected from those, it's not by their choice, it's by the fact that they, you know, for me even, that my parents moved us into the city so that we could have more opportunity. And yes, while they did bring us to ceremony, we weren't in proximity to our homelands or to our teachings or to our community all the time. And so allowing that to kind of be brought into different spaces. And again, it's also recognizing organizations that are already doing this work. So such as like Indigenous clean energy, like I said, we have that holistic approach to what these jobs are going to look like. And so that means going beyond just, funding the salaries of youth to go into community and work within the climate space. It means also recognizing that they need to have access to elders and access to language and ensure that that's being incorporated in everything that they're doing. Especially if, we're looking at kind of the well-rounded approach of what a youth climate corps could have. For me, we're in the energy space, but we're also looking at folks that are in protecting biodiversity, folks that are looking at water protection, and we want to still make sure that that's embodied in the work that we're doing. But that also comes with beautiful, beautiful teachings that you can hear from elders and from knowledge holders that we can really have in those spaces as well. The other thing that we want is we want to have folks that live off the land at the forefront, and oftentimes that's something like if we're having like an advisory committee of some sorts, it's looking at the folks again that you won't always see on panels like this, or you won't always see at conferences and events. It's people that you have to go into community and really ask, who are those folks that are living off the land? I was at the Métis Environmental Leadership Conference with Métis Nation of Saskatchewan just this year. And the really beautiful thing that I think Jordan Burnoff really mobilized was having people who lived off the land their entire lives speak on panels for the first time in their entire lives. And when you heard them speak, you could see the love and the teachings that they had. And it was unlike any other learning I had ever had and ever seen of people who, were really in a space that could provide those teachings. And so we want that land-based learning as well, allowing people to go back and to teach that, while the technical side is important, it's also about behavioral change and how do we adjust that and shape that in our communities in a way that, we're not just, working in the clean energy space to produce energy. We're also doing it in a way that embodies kind of, energy efficiency and making sure that we're using less and we're living within our means, and we're not taking more than we need, and we're living in harmony with the lands, the waters, and our other living relatives on the land. And so for us, that was a lot of the things that we discussed as coworkers. And so it was beautiful for us to get to talk about it. And yeah, I'm happy to hear from my other panelists as well.
I think I'm next. So yeah, thank you, Aubrey. I was just like nodding with what you were saying because I agree with all of that. And I think that a youth climate corps that centers Indigenous knowledge and leadership at its core, that potential, like the thought of that just really gets me very excited. At Indigenous Climate Action, we participate in the global Indigenous peoples movements in spaces like the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And there's a slogan that we've taken over the last several years, and it's colonialism caused climate change, Indigenous rights are the solution. And so in addition to being a very snappy phrase, I think that offers a real blueprint out of the crisis that we're in. And I think that the most exciting possibility of a youth climate corps is that it's providing an alternative to our current capitalist economy. And so centering that knowledge and leadership, sort of like what Aubrey-Anne said, of moving beyond the need for certain qualifications, like even a high school degree, beyond, the ability of to write a perfect CV, moving beyond these ideas and really honoring and uplifting that knowledge. I think also moving beyond the idea of a green job just being kind of a one-off, right? One single project, looking into long-term employment. But I think also the goal being, and this is something I say a lot about myself, is in education, climate education and training, I want to ideally work myself out of a job. I don't want to have to do this for the rest of my life, right? Like if we're continuing to have this conversation in 15 years, we're not where we're supposed to be. So I think that like moving and envisioning that where we are able to get to a place where we have stabilized greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and we are now adapting to a new world. And we can't use these same systems that cause that in the first place to try and solve it. And so for those of us who are 30 and under, we have lived the entirety of our lives with the effects of climate breakdown. And at the same time, we've witnessed the failure of political leaders, corporations, and entities like the UNFCCC fail to take action at the scale that is truly needed to address the crisis that we're in. In addition to this, I feel like we often find ourselves coming up against misunderstandings and conflicts with our older generations who did not have to operate in this context that we are living under, and the stresses and the real distress that comes with experiencing climate breakdown. We oftentimes, I find a lot of older people were really patronized to me, and that whole idea of, oh, young people don't want to work anymore, and it's because you're on that phone, and just like all of these things. But it's harder for them to understand that we live in this context where we don't have a stable climate. We never have. And it's something that's really painful and difficult to wrangle with, that sometimes, that the life ways and the practices of our ancestors, we can't practice in the same way. And that future that we were promised doesn't exist in the same way unless we really do something about it. And I think that work of a climate core could support that return to our lifeways and cultural practices that have long been disrupted due to colonialism and white supremacy. And we know that this work is already being done in our communities. I could think of so many people off the top of my head in my community across the Haudenosaunee Confederacy that are already doing this. There's just a number, and we know the importance of these, and we want to practice them. There are just many, many systemic barriers to doing so. The rent still's got to get paid, right? And our communities are often dealing with higher costs of living for basic necessities, and we often find ourselves stuck in a rock and a hard place. And I think we've discussed this enough, of that choice between that sort of low-paying minimum wage work, extractive industry, or work that takes you outside of your community. A youth climate core could really address some of those barriers by creating that work that is meaningful and aligns with your worldview and your values, work that has high wages and benefits, flexible hours that allow for your time in community and certain ceremonial obligations, work that provides childcare that could potentially allow you to bring your children with you, to ensure that cultural transmission is taking place. I think a lot of work is really welcoming to young parents and to children, right? And addressing that as well is an important piece of climate action. And I think it's also work that is accessible. Disability justice is also climate justice. And so really transforming our idea of what is work, who is qualified for that work, who can do that work, and what that looks like. I actually just had this really great conversation over the weekend. Myself and Serena attended a Haudenosaunee Youth and Elders climate gathering that was hosted by the Haudenosaunee Environmental Task Force. And on the last day, we had this discussion with one of our hereditary leaders, where he was asking us, he struggles to get his grandchildren involved in gardening, not just planting, but weeding and seeing it all through. And, he wanted kind of our perspective on why this was happening. And I think we were able to have this discussion with him, where we were sharing the realities of our lives, right? We want to do this. It's just hard sometimes with the nature of the work that we're in. I think so many of us in the climate sphere know a lot of it has you traveling. You're often outside of your community. I feel really grateful to do that, but it does take me away from certain practices. I feel like there are certain things that I miss out on being at home. And it's hard to commit to something when you're not going to be able to see it all the way out through. And so I think that a youth climate core could really meet that gap. And I often joke that I just want to be Haudenosaunee for a living. And I think that a youth climate core could actually make that joke a real possibility for my people, but for all Indigenous people, by moving these funds away from extractive industry, moving that away from fossil fuels, and into these life-sustaining practices. So much of our capitalist economy is built on, I think of it as stealing from the future. This fossil fuel economy that we've been on for over 100 years has stolen from the future, and now we're facing the consequences. And now we're in this place where we have to deal with the realities of a climate change world and rethinking what it means to be successful and what work means in a climate change world. And I think that a youth climate core could, meet some of those gaps. And I just got all fired up. So I'm going to pass off to, I think, Janelle.
Ooh, you fired me up. Y'all are so awesome. I don't want to, I agree completely with everything that has been said. And so I'll try to keep it brief, because I know time is running away from us. One thing I think, we are about to answer a very important question about how we relate to nations, and how we relate to state. So acknowledging that, Youth Climate Corps is state-led, federal funded, and despite the growing awareness about Indigenous rights and sovereignty, and that's not something that us as Indigenous people have to earn. It's something that's inherent and is recognized on a time scale that is supersedes Canada or any of the colonial projects. But unfortunately, federal programs are still the fastest way to get a large, sweeping climate solution centered program out in the world. So I think we have the opportunity now to address like what it means to operate in that realm and to accept that funding, but to be accountable to nations rather than the state. So I think that'll look like, making sure that this program is building those relationships with nations and has the flexibility to serve a diverse group of needs and to really be able to do work that is regional and community specific with their own laws, governance, language, and yeah, to build something that's reciprocal and accountable to nations, and to hold firm with that with the government and say, this is the government owes us to fund this project because it's been so complicit in the climate crisis, and but that the true accountability measures are going to live in our relationships with Indigenous nations. And that's a big question. It's a sticky question, but there's no one I trust more with that task than young workers and young Indigenous leaders. So I think a Youth Climate Corps that really centers Indigenous knowledge and is not watered down by government and is, has a movement of young people and supporters behind it is really powerful. The rock in the hard place is really live for me in my community. I think after decades and decades of being left out of projects and letting wealth be made from the land and resources that belong to us. Right now, equity ownership on major projects looks really appealing. I just published personally an op-ed in The Breach about economic reconciliation with an acknowledgement that the climate movement has not put forward a vision that addresses the colonial imposed poverty on Indigenous nations. A lot of people are scared to talk about reparations and accountability and reciprocity. And that has made it so industry, the very people that have caused the climate crisis, are now championing economic reconciliation and saying that they're the ones that are going to bring the prosperity to nations. And so I think any program and vision that is about economic reclamation, so like Carol said, I love what you said about just like getting to be like, I want to be Stellatan for a living for sure. I think that will be really key. Right now, I think government is really focused on like Indigenous climate adaptation, but it's really important that this work is not just about cleaning up the mess that the colonial governments and the industry they support has made, but about reclaiming the practices and the ways of living in order to do our own healing. And then also to do some economic innovation. I think young people, this generation, will be on the cutting edge of answering the questions that have not been answered. And so I'm really excited to see, again, with like a collaboration between a young worker-led movement with strong relationships with Indigenous nation and strong accountability to Indigenous nations would look like. Pass it to you, Serena.
Woo! You guys are awesome. Just really extending my gratitude again that I get to live in a generation where we have these badass people that I get to work with. And yes, we're dealing with a problem that isn't ours, but like, look who is trying to solve it. So we'll get somewhere. The Youth Climate Corps, if centered in Indigenous knowledge and leadership by nations, will be a platform and a framework that will support the acceleration of an implementation of a just transition in our communities through Indigenous youth leadership, which I don't think we've ever really seen. The Youth Climate Corps will look like a cultural shift back to the way we used to live before, while aligning with new technologies that support a transition. The Youth Climate Corps must be implemented in consultation with our nations, but not only consultation, but in partnership and leadership with our people. This must be nation to nation building when it comes to the Youth Climate Corps. We should be able to define what the Youth Climate Corps looks like for each individual community and nations. One of the biggest priorities when we look at the Youth Climate Corps is the scope and the scale of what it will look like, especially within our communities and with previous government funded programs, such as the Indigenous off-diesel initiative. They have about, I think, max 20 people per 2 years. That is not the scale we need to address the climate crisis in place. So for me, if a Youth Climate Corps is centered in Indigenous knowledge and the leadership of Indigenous nations, it would look like this. And I'm going to preface that this is just my opinion. I do not represent my community. I do not represent Indigenous peoples all over. So I cannot speak from this collective perspective only within the conversations I've had. And if a government wants to do the Youth Climate Corps right, then they better have a big engagement budget, because they best be going to all communities across this country. It needs to be led by Indigenous nations and communities, and it must be a nation-to-nation building. We must inherently enable our sovereignty within this funding program. So given the autonomy of someone to define the training themselves and the environmental jobs in our communities beyond the STEM outlook, we need policy, we need lawyers, we need trades. I know I was told not to be in trades when I was younger. No, we need that. Could be gardens, could be food sovereignty, could be being Haudenosaunee, right? The training must be for us by us. So a lot of the time in programs and government trainings, we're learning elsewhere and we're being told, this is what we need to know to be able to do this. But we already know what we need to know. And that's at home with our own people, with our elders, with our youth, with our knowledge keepers. Next, stable and ongoing funding and jobs beyond the 2-year training that is governed by our nation and is actually non-discretionary funding. We don't want to or have to report to you. These training programs also should be connected with jobs afterwards that are accessible and in community. And they can also be newly created jobs. Exactly. If you want to create, as Carol said, a job to be Haudenosaunee, we should be able to do that job. That means we can harvest corn all year, we can tap trees, we can pick strawberries. That is a climate solution itself, and that role would be really important in our communities. Reserved portions for Indigenous youth under the YCC. So First Nations, Métis, Inuit, we need to make sure that we are represented at the table in the scope of what a Youth Climate Corps look like. And we're not going to take a Sustainable Jobs Act approach where they have 1 seat per Indigenous body. No, I want to be the Youth Climate Corps. I want the Youth Climate Corps to be in every single community across the country. And I saw a question in the chat. So I hope you know I'm actually already thinking about this. This Youth Climate Corps funding needs to be allocated out of formal government structures. So it does not have to be band councils. Grassroots support it, right? Who is doing the most work? Those on the front lines, as Carol mentioned. And who should we support? The grassroots work. So I think we need to look beyond these government structures, because I know, like, community energy champions, I can't be a community energy champion because I don't want to work with my band council. And so that's just the way it is, right? Upholding those structures, and the Youth Climate Corps can't do that. But instead, what it can do is provide opportunities to look at this differently and to have jobs in different structures. A big one that I just want to, there's a couple more. I won't talk about no educational requirements. I felt like my fellow panelists really put that forward, because the smartest people I know do not have a formal education. But this is a big one to me, is supporting communities with climate action and just transition plans. There's many communities that don't know what the heck they're doing right now. So are we going to also put funding towards those plans in place that will then support the development of green jobs in our communities? And I feel like a lot of the time we're being so reactive. Like, no, let's be proactive for once and create a plan. And right now it is still kind of reactive because we're in a climate crisis, but we can get started now and make a difference. And then lastly, healing justice funds. So I put it as cultural professional development. It sounded kind of funny to me, but let's put funding. If we're going to put people in these green jobs, this is really taxing work. This is full of climate anxiety. It's hard work. It's long hours. And you're talking about colonialism all the time. So let's make sure people get out on the land, really establish that relationship with their territories, really can be who they are, can be within their culture. And let's make sure that's prioritized in the Youth Climate Corps as well. And I just want to end on, this is outside of my, I guess, my pitch for Youth Climate Corps, is last week I got to put up a solar project, and I got to do it with my hereditary governance and governance outside of the band council system through Sacred Earth Solar, our grassroots organization. And one, I got to train people in my community to implement the project themselves. I got to provide those resources. They worked on that project themselves. They put it up themselves. And the feeling I had after leaving the project being completed was one of the best feelings in the world I've ever had. And I just want a world where everyone can feel the way that I did that day. So I think that's what a Youth Climate Corps would provide, is that fulfillment and excitement to be able to create a community that you want for the coming phases. So yeah, Nyao Goa, and thank you so much. And this has been a lovely, lovely webinar.
Thank you so much, everyone. So moved. I have so many thoughts. And I just want to share one, which is that at the core of working on this campaign, something that I deeply desire is that knowledge that you folks have been talking about, that intergenerational land-based education that you got from your families, from your communities. And as a settler who moved here in my lifetime, my parents weren't able to give me that knowledge, you know, they barely had that knowledge of their own communities as having moved multiple times in their lifetimes. And I can just see the revolutionary potential in this campaign, because I know how much the settler colonial state of Canada profits when it pits settlers against Indigenous communities. You know, they actually succeed every time, and that's how they win. And if we create this Youth Climate Corps, it's sort of the solution that we bring young settlers to learn about the land, to kind of actually start talking about that healing justice where there's been such a rupture. You know, we don't know anything about where we come from, and we're so disconnected from this land, and we feel it in our bodies, and it could be that solution. But yeah, I mean, listening to all of you talk about that makes it feel so much more real and so much closer. And that brings me great joy. I know that we're short on time, and a lot of you have actually addressed some of the questions that were sort of asked in the Q&A. I want to open the space to capture any final thoughts you may have for the participants here. Maybe something that you wanted to reinforce, or maybe something that you missed and you do want to say before we wrap up today. And the floor is yours.
I can just chime in kind of quick, because this is something that I also say in a lot of the panels that I'm on, is that at this point in time, I think that every job is a climate job. And so wherever you're at, like whatever field you're in, I think there's ways of, you know, participating in that paradigm shift of how do we bring our human activity back in line with nature. And so I think there's a role for everybody to play in that. I saw a question also, how can the YCC foster Indigenous settler coalitions and collaborations for Indigenous action and justice? And kind of like what you were saying, Bushra, is that we can't use the same methods that caused the climate crisis to solve it. And it's going to take all of us collectively, you know, shifting our minds to a better world. And when it comes to white supremacy, when it comes to racism, that is white people's problems just as much as it is our problems. And we cannot solve that without our allies participating in that, and not in just like in a checkbox way, but really transforming and rethinking how we relate to one another and how we relate to the land. And so I think this panel, you know, I'm definitely very fired up. It was a great way to spend time on a Wednesday, but there's a role for everybody to play in this, in creating the world that we want to live in. And that's all.
Thank you, Carol.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Janelle. Go.
Okay. Yeah, I totally agree about yeah, it's time to really think about the networks and institutions we're a part of, and how we can move this vision forward, even if you're not working a traditional environmentalist job. And also wanted to say, like, if you're bought into the message that we're sharing, we don't need to wait until a project launches or a coalition is built for you to learn what it looks like to be in a right reciprocal relation with the Indigenous nations whose land you're on. So definitely would encourage people to take steps to learn about whose territory you're on, to show up to community events, to meet people in the community, and not in a way that's extractive or to gain something, but to also think about the skills that you have to offer, and to start building a mutually respectful, reciprocal relationship, so that when this work is ready, it'll be easy for us all to plug in.
Yeah, I think for me too, I just want to reiterate that, we can't just validate this work when there is a Youth Climate Corps created. It's work that's already being done in communities by people who have recognized the gaps that exist. And so oftentimes these organizations are grassroots and they're smaller. And so take the time to look into the ones that exist in your region and find out ways in which you can support. We were just having a conversation this week about how important it is to have allies in relation with us when we're doing this, because it's work that we need to do together, else it's not going to make any difference for any of our communities in the end. And so, yeah, definitely looking into different ones like that. And if anyone ever wants to reach out, I'm open to chatting more about it.
Last but not least, I guess I'll make a final mention of just, I want to say I've been with 7Gen, the org that Janelle's with, for 5 years. I've taken Carol's climate leadership program. ICE has invested a whole bunch of time into me. Sacred Earth Solar really has put that mentorship in me for the past 2 years. I wouldn't be where I am today without all of these amazing organizations and so many more who have invested in me, who have created training opportunities, who have mentored me. So I think it's just really understanding the gift that mentorship and training and opportunity can really bring to our lives and can bring to our communities. And I feel like I'm at this full circle moment now with having all this mentorship of, I'm not that sad little girl working at the Dev Corp, feeling like no one really cared as a young person what I had to say. No, I'm doing projects in my community. I'm working for my people. I'm working on this national scale. And I'm really putting my money where my mouth is. And I wouldn't be here without the capacity building and the training and the opportunities of these fellow organizations around me. So invest in us. We're doing the work already, and invest in the Youth Climate Corps, because this can be accelerated on a level we can't even comprehend at this point. So yeah, now I'll go and thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That is all the time we have. But if folks have questions for us at the Climate Emergency Unit, or all of the incredible baddies on this panel, please, we will share contact information. We'll drop the websites of each organization represented here today in the chat, and we'll share links and resources in a follow-up email with the transcription and like a recording of this. I saw a lot of people being like, is the chat going to be saved? The conversation will continue. My hope and vision is this is the first of many as we continue to campaign on this, and as the work that the folks on this panel continue to do on the ground. Some final calls to action related to the Youth Climate Corps campaign. We do have a National Day of Action coming up on September 17th. Join an action in your community, or organize one if there isn't one. If you or someone you know lives in Halifax, we are putting together a snap action ahead of the Liberal Cabinet retreat next weekend. Please get in touch with us. That's me or Juan or Leah, so that we can bring a Youth Climate Corps to the forefront of this government's priorities. Lastly, you can get involved with the campaign either through joining or starting a chapter in your own community by getting your labor union, your city, your student union, or your First Nation to formally endorse the campaign. You can also join yet another Slack network of organizers across so-called Canada to stay active in this campaign. We'll be sending you all of this in an email with the recording. One final comment before we close is that I'm going to invite Brittany, our graphic recorder, to walk us through the recording or her art piece, and give us a brief summary of what she heard and captured. So I'm gonna try to pass it on.
Hey, can everyone hear me and can everyone see the graphic?
Yes.
Awesome. So this is a working graphic, so it was all created live. So I'm still kind of adding and sort of summarizing everything that was said. So I'm going to walk through some of the things that I heard that really jumped out at me. And like I said, I can add more to this later and finish it up and color it later on. So things that I heard, the story about should we join the military when they were sort of, you know, the new baby had arrived and they were thinking like, what should we do for a job? But military didn't seem like the right option for so many reasons. It didn't really align with their values or their principles. It just wasn't the right fit. So we know that young people need jobs that do embody their values and principles, and we need to empower youth to create solutions to the climate crisis. So land protection, I heard lots and lots about. So that involves like traditional teachings, learning from community, value quality and ability of Indigenous people and living on the land. And someone had said, we have a responsibility to the land. And I heard about sort of planting that seed of education. So we have that girl at the top there, sort of surrounded by all of those ideas coming out from that seed. The education and training was also a big piece. So mentorship, access to elders. But with that mentorship, we are remembering like Indigenous youth are not just, you know, they themselves are experts and should be treated as leaders. So Indigenous youth as leaders was a big piece to this. We need to build capacity for that and to create more meaningful work. We need a holistic approach. We need to learn from existing community programs and highlight clean energy options. And I'm just gonna scooch right to the very end of this river on the side, which is sort of like the pathway forward to where we're headed. So move funds away from fossil fuels. We need to like come together to develop economic innovation. We need stable and ongoing funding. And this is going to be nation to nation. So these opportunities should also be available in rural communities. So that's just a quick overview. There's still more to be added. Thanks.
Sorry, I realized I was muted. Thank you so much, Brittany. This is so beautiful, and I cannot wait to sort of share this. And thank you everyone on this panel. Truly, it was so beautiful to witness your brilliance and just be in your company. I'm so grateful for the fact that life brought you into the specific journeys that you're on. Yeah, I think this is all for today. I hope everyone that's tuned in, a good night.